Hello and welcome to a discussion of Joseph and His Brothers by Thomas Mann. I've been reading this novel together with Matthew of Mayberry Bookclub, and I will leave a link to his video in the show notes below. We are reading this for the Marching Mammoths Challenge and for the Read German 2020 Challenge. Jack, the rambling raconteur, is also reading along, and I will leave a link to his video in the show notes below. Joseph and His Brothers is divided into 4 novels, each of which is divided into 7 parts. In this second video I discuss the second novel, which is called Young Joseph. Part 1 is called THOTH. I'm going to read a passage from the section headed Body and Mind. If one were to trace how the relationship between Joseph and his brothers worsened over the years, from details to generality, from the day's annoyances and misunderstandings back to a fundamental basis, one would encounter envy and arrogance as the first and last causes. And anyone who loves justice will find it difficult to decide whether it was the former or latter failing, that is, whether in personal terms it was the individual or the group as it grew ever more menacing in its actions toward him, to which principal blame should be assigned for all this misfortune. Indeed, justice and the honest desire to cast off every possible seductive bias may perhaps lead a person to chastise arrogance as the primary iniquity and source of all evil. But then again, justice would demand that some person admit that both now and at the time the world has seldom seen such cause for arrogance, and thus, to be sure, for envy as well. Part 2 is called Abraham. I'm going to read a passage from the section headed How Abraham Discovered God. The first father had many other things he could teach about God, but he did not know how to tell about God. Not in the way others knew how to tell stories about their gods. There were no stories about God. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing of all, the courage with which Abraham posited God's existence as a given, without any attendant circumstances or stories, but simply by saying God. God had not arisen, had not been born of any female, nor was there a female beside his throne, no Ishtar, no Baalat, or Mother of God. How could that be? Simple reason led one to realize that such a thing was inconceivable in view of God's nature. He had planted the tree of knowledge and of death in Eden, and man had eaten from it. It was for man to give birth and die, but not for God, and he beheld no divine female at his side, because he did not need to know one, and instead was himself both Baal and Baalat in one. Part 3 is called Joseph and Benjamin. I'm going to read a passage from the section headed The Grove of Adoni. Joseph often came to this place with Benjamin, his 4th brother, who at the age of 8 now had begun to outgrow the watchful eye of women, and enjoyed trying to match strides with his mother's firstborn. He was a chubby cheeked boy who no longer ran about naked, but wore a short-sleeved knee-length tunic of dark blue or rust-red wool with embroidery along the hem. He had lovely grey eyes that held an expression of utter trust when he would look up at his older brother. His thick, almost metallic hair ran from mid-brow to the nape of his neck and fit tightly to his skull like a sleek helmet with slits for the ears, which were as small and sturdy as his nose and his stubby-fingered hands, one of which he always gave to his brother when they walked together. An engaging boy, he had inherited Rachel's cordiality, but over his little person lay the shadow of a shy melancholy, for he had not grown up unaware of the hour and manner of his mother's death, of what he had done while still all unconscious, and the sense of tragically guiltless guilt he carried with him was nourished by Jacob's attitude toward him, which, though certainly not without tenderness, was imbued with a painful reticence, to the point where his father was more likely to avoid his gaze than to seek it out. From time to time, however, Jacob would ardently press his youngest son to him, call him Benoni, and whisper words of Rachel in his ear. Part 4 is called The Dreamer. I'm going to read a passage from the section headed The Coat of Many Colours. Not at harvest time as planned, but much sooner, on the night of the spring's full moon, the sons of Leah came hurtling head over heels back to Hebron from the pastures at Shechem. They arrived ostensibly to eat the Pesach lamb with their father and observe the moon with him, but in reality they came because they had received news affecting all the brothers, news so upsetting that they absolutely had to convince themselves on the spot of its truth and to learn if it might be altered. The matter was so important and frightening that the handmaid's sons could think of nothing more urgent than to delegate one of their own to embark on the 4-day journey from Hebron to Shechem, for no other purpose than to bring news to their distant brothers. And of course they had entrusted fleet-footed Naphtali with the message. In terms of speed, it was ultimately of no consequence, however, who made the journey. Naphtali had to ride on an ass too, and whether the pair of legs dangling at the ass's side were long or short made no difference really. The journey took about 4 days in any case. But in fact it was Naphtali, Bilhah's son, with whose person speed was associated, and by shared conviction his was the role of the messenger. And since his tongue was equally nimble, it is true that at least in those final moments the brothers would learn the facts somewhat more quickly than from any of the others. What had happened? Jacob had given Joseph a gift. Part 5 is called The Journey to His Brothers. I'm going to read a passage from the section headed An Extraordinary Demand. Nonetheless, the golden sun was readied for a journey rooted in fraternal strife. To the extent it was a reoccurrence, and Jacob saw to other similarities as well, making sure that Joseph rode off in the early morning before sunrise, just as he had done in his own day. He was scarcely even Jacob as they said their farewells, but rather Rebekah was the mother. He held his departing son for a long time, murmured blessings against his cheek, took a protective amulet from his own neck and hung it around the boy's, and hugged him yet again, behaving more or less as if Joseph were travelling for who knew how long, or forever, 17 days or more, toward the utterly strange world of Naharaim, when in fact the lad, provisioned with more than ample food, was setting out on a jaunt over safe roads to the hardly distant Shechem, much to his delight. Which shows how excessive a man's behaviour can appear when one's awareness is one's yardstick, but how, when observed from the viewpoint of a fate still quite unknown to the man, the same conduct seems all too fitting. This can even offer consolation once the conscious mind clears and we learn what was truly meant. Therefore, people should never say their farewells lightly, for then, no matter what they'll be able to say, at least I pressed him to my heart. At this point I decided that although MANN has richly imagined the stories from Genesis, which I know very well, I felt there was just not enough narrative content either to interest me or to make it an enjoyable read, and that in fact I was finding it a very dispiriting slog through MANN's dense prose to find the highlights that I have read above. So at this point I informed Matthew that I would not be continuing to read a book that we were both not enjoying, and suggested that we read something else together. So this second novel, although it contains some excellent imaginative writing, is just not enjoyable enough for me to recommend it, and so my rating for this second novel is C. And now here's a quick recap, and I'll be back soon with another BookTube video.